In my programme yesterday, I said that the 24 hours which had preceded it seemed exceptionally consequential in terms of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and seemed to me to mark a tipping point. Well, the 24 hours that have followed and which precede today's programme seem to me to be equally, at least equally dramatic and consequential as well. The first thing to say is that the Russian advance continues, and it continues right across the contact line. The most dramatic events continue to happen around Pokrovsk, and there is a temptation, I think, irresistible in some quarters, to reduce the entire conflict that is taking place in Ukraine to two battles, one playing out in Kursk region in Russia and the other playing out in Pokrovsk region in Donbass. That really isn't the case. As we will see, the Russians are advancing everywhere, including, by the way, in Kursk region. But let's begin firstly with the situation in Pokrovsk and the area of Pokrovsk. And I'm going to say again that one of the great problems that there is that events are moving far ahead of the Russian Defense Ministry's reporting of them, so that sometimes, very often, we can't be absolutely sure exactly what is happening. We rely on various reporters and bloggers, some of whom are connected in some way to the militaries on either side. There's the DS mapping project from Ukraine, which has a connection to the Ukrainian General Staff, and which, as a result, provides what I think is generally fairly accurate information, at least about Russian advances. And we also have photographic and film evidence, though this is sometimes more difficult to understand than I think some of the people who rely on it appreciate it. And there is always the possibility with film and photographic evidence of manipulation. To say again, the fact that somebody raises a flag in a particular building, in a particular town or village, might not mean that that particular town or village has fallen under the control of the army to whom the flag belongs. It might even be the case that a unit or a small group of soldiers from that army have entered the village, raised the flag, and then immediately left, simply in order to create the impression that there's been an advance in that village when there has not been. Anyway, let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk area as of today, or at least this morning, the morning of the 29th of August, morning London time, I should make clear, and discuss what we seem to know. The first is that it looks as if the Russians have advanced quite deep into Selidovo. The two towns that are being attacked at the moment, or which are being stormed by the Russians, to our certain knowledge, are Selidovo and Novogrodivka. Novogrodivka had at one point a pre-war population of around 17,000. Selidovo, well, now I see some claims that its pre-war population was 24,000. I've seen other claims that it was as low as 10,000. I'm not going to try and work out what its population was. I should say that census statistics coming from Ukraine are famously unreliable. Ukraine has not held a proper census for decades. But so all the population figures we get are ballpark estimates, and they might be wildly wrong. But anyway, suffice to say that Selidovo is a town. It's not a village. It's a fairly large place. It could be 10,000 or 24,000 for all I know, but it is a significant settlement. And as I've discussed in previous programs, it was also a significant and important logistical hub for the Ukrainian armed forces, supplies for the battlefronts across Ukraine would arrive by rail and sometimes road at Pokrovsk, and they would be distributed from Pokrovsk to the various battlefronts. Some supplies would be sent down the main road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka to strengthen Ukrainian positions, to keep the Ukrainian troops fighting in places like Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk supplied. Other supplies would be sent southwards to Selidovo, and once they'd reached Selidovo, they'd be sent from Selidovo either towards Avdiivka, when the Ukrainians controlled that town, or towards Krasnogorovka, when the Ukrainians also controlled that town. Of course, they no longer control either of these places, or towards Kurachovo and Vuhledar, which they still control, but perhaps not for very much longer. So Selidovo was an important hub in the Ukrainian logistics system. Now, we have film from Selidovo, and it is not entirely easy to understand, but to the extent that we have it, and it comes from the Russians, it appears to confirm the reports that there is fighting going on in Selidovo. So firstly, we have what appears to be clear confirmation, pictures of flags and such things, that the Russians are in control, not just of the village of Mikhailovka, which is located immediately to the east of Selidovo. In fact, there is apparently a continuous built-up area that effectively joins Mikhailovka with Selidovo itself. Anyway, the film appears to confirm that the Russians control Mikhailovka, and they control the coal mine and the slag heap immediately to the west of Mikhailovka. And there's drone footage which shows the even bigger slag heap located close to Selidovo itself. It's an enormous slag heap. It towers into the sky, and it's not completely clear to me who exactly controls that slag heap. But beyond that, we can see what the military summary channel elegantly refers to as fire anomalies. In other words, explosions, smoke, all of which almost certainly is telltale signs of fighting, and it is visibly taking place in the metropolitan area of Selidovo, which lies west of this giant slag heap, and all but confirms the presence of Russian troops deep inside Selidovo itself. So it does look as if Selidovo is indeed in the process of being stormed by the Russian army. Now, getting a clear picture of where exactly the Russians have reached in Selidovo itself depends very much on which mapping project or reporting project you follow. Some reports claim that the Ukrainians have pulled their troops completely out of Selidovo, which would suggest that the entire town has been abandoned to the Russians and will fall under Russian control over the course of today. That, by the way, might be true if the Russians already control the giant slag heap, which they probably do. Just saying. Other reporting projects and mapping projects are much more conservative and suggest that the Russians control perhaps 40 to 50% of the town. Some reports, most of the reports, show that the Russians have at least reached the center of the town. Now, I have myself been burnt on numerous occasions by taking information purely from reporting projects. I remember back in May, there were lots of claims that the Russians, the group of forces north, had captured the entirety of the town of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, and including the area of the high-rise buildings north of the Volcha River. And this illusion of Russian control in that area persisted, as I remember, for about a week, perhaps even longer, until it eventually turned out that, in fact, there were still very significant areas of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, which remained under Ukrainian control, and in particular the area of the high-rise buildings, the citadel area in Volchansk, was still under Ukrainian control. And in fact, there are parts of the citadel area, the high-rise building area in Volchansk, which are still under Ukrainian control, though the Russians are fighting for them, and they appear to be capturing the buildings in that area one by one. So, given that, and by the way, there have been various other instances where similar things have happened, it's perhaps unwise to make too categorical assumptions as to where the Russians are in Selidovo as of this morning. But there is no doubt that they are there. As I said, the fact that we have the sight of the smoke and the explosions, that tells us that the Russians have indeed entered Selidovo and are pushing fast, perhaps to the center of the town. Perhaps they've reached the center of the town already. Maybe the town is about to fall. Maybe the Ukrainians still have some fight left in the town. It's very difficult to say at the moment. But anyway, we have definite proof that the Russians are indeed in Selidovo. Now, further north, there is the other town of Novogrodivka. Now, here we've had lots of reports and information. We've had occasional photos and pictures, and they do show the Russians. These pictures, they tend to be very brief, but they do show the Russians in all sorts of positions around the town, and there does seem to be little doubt that the town is almost entirely, or perhaps entirely, under Russian control. Now, yesterday I said that there were reports, or at least information, that the Ukrainians still maintained a presence in two parts of Novogrodivka. One was the very northern tip of Novogrodivka, where there was a built-up area, a residential area, located between two other big slag heaps, one to the east of the built-up area, one to the west. Then, over the course of yesterday, we got news that the Russians had captured the slag heap that was on the eastern side of northern Novogrodivka. That information came from the Russians. Today, the Ukrainians, the DS mapping project, is telling us that the Russians also control the slag heap to the west of the built-up area, at the very north of Novogrodivka. That seems to me to suggest that northern Novogrodivka, the very top, most northern part of Novogrodivka, is now fully under Russian control. That the Russians control all of Novogrodivka to the north. We do not have information about what has happened to the Ukrainian troops who were in the western part of Novogrodivka. I'm going to make a guess that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from western Novogrodivka as well. Maybe they have withdrawn to the area of the coal mine that is located to the west of Novogrodivka, where there is also a slag heap, and maybe they're intending to make their next stand there. Who knows? But I think now that the Russians probably do control the whole of Novogrodivka. However, it should be said that though we do have we do have some pictures of Russian troops in Novogrodivka, we are well short of a complete picture of what is actually happening in this particular town, and it is at least possible that there are Ukrainian troops in some places, maybe cut off, maybe surrounded, maybe there continues to be a mopping up operation going on. Almost certainly that is the case. The Russian Defense Ministry, so far, is saying nothing about the battles for Novogrodivka and for Selidovo. Now, further north, we've had lots of reports that I discussed yesterday that the village of Grodivka has also passed under Russian control. And again, I believe that to be true, but again, we have no actual photographic evidence so far that that is in fact true. I believe it is true because of some other information that has come to light, which is that the Russians have now entered the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, known as Mirnograd, and that fighting is now taking place inside Mirnograd itself. I will come to that in a moment. I think that if that is the case, then Grodivka obviously must have fallen. But let me say again that I am not absolutely certain of this. We still don't have positive categorical proof. We have no photographs or pictures or films of maps showing Grodivka under Russian control. But all the indications are that the Russians do indeed control Grodivka. And then there are the villages of Krasny Yar, Kruty Yar, and Nikolaevka, which lie north of Novogrodivka and immediately to the west of Grodivka itself. And again, we have various reports that the Russians are now in control of all of these villages. I believe that is indeed the case, but we have no photographic or film evidence of that either. And the Russian Defense Ministry is not providing us with that information for the moment. But again, various mapping and reporting projects are telling us that this is indeed so. Now, we come to the most interesting part, because we also have information that the Russians are present in Mirnograd, that a force has entered Mirnograd from the south, presumably from the area of Nikolaevka, the village, or perhaps along the road from Grodivka, that they pushed quite a significant distance inside Mirnograd. There's been suggestions that this is an advance party and that the main force of the Russians is still to reach Mirnograd, but will eventually do so and will join up with this force. If that is the case, then I think we can say definitely that the battle for Mirnograd and ultimately for Pokrovsk itself has now begun. So, a massive crisis facing the Ukrainians in this area. As I said, there's still huge amount of uncertainty about the precise details. But I don't think anyone any longer seriously doubts the overall situation in the Pokrovsk area. It does look as if the whole situation, the whole defense positions around Pokrovsk are collapsing, that Selidovo is being stormed, that Novogrodivka almost certainly has fallen, that Grodivka almost certainly has fallen, and that the Russians are inside Mirnograd. And on the assumption that the Russians are already inside Mirnograd, I think we can take it as fact that the supply roads from Mirnograd west to Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar are no longer functioning. How do you send supplies along this road if the city through which that road passes is itself under attack? And with the Russians unquestionably inside Selidovo, we can also, I think, take it as read that the supply routes from Selidovo to Kurakovo and to other positions on the southern front lines in Donbass, in Kurakovo and Vuhledar and elsewhere, that the supplies there have been cut as well. So already we can see the crisis developing. Now, as I've discussed, alongside the battles for Selidovo, Novogrodivka, Mirnograd, and ultimately for Pokrovsk itself, there is also a battle underway further south. The Russians have established themselves in a village called Memrik. There are reports that once they've consolidated their positions, they will push on ultimately towards a town called Ukrainsk, and that they have cut the supply lines to Karlovka, a little to the east, and that the Ukrainian troops in Karlovka are withdrawing to the nearby village of Galitsinivka, which is their main supply base, their forward supply base, as they've been trying to defend Karlovka from the Russians. Now, it's being increasingly suggested that the Russians are now in a position where they might start to take Ukrainian troops in this southern area, south of Selidovo, into a cauldron, an actual cauldron of a kind that we haven't really seen in the war up to now. There have been many cauldrons in various towns and cities, occasions when Ukrainian troops have been surrounded and trapped and forced to surrender. That happened, for example, in Avdiivka back in February, and there have been other incidents when small numbers of Ukrainian troops, 50 or 100 or so, have been trapped and cut off from resupply. But what supposedly, and I do stress supposedly because again, I don't know, but what supposedly is starting to develop in the area south of Selidovo is an actual cauldron, one in which several thousand Ukrainian troops stationed on open ground in fields are gradually encircled by Russian forces advancing from various directions. And the directions in question are obviously these Russian troops that are pushing towards Memrik and Ukrainsk. Also, the Russian forces that have been advancing from Avdiivka itself to Karlovka through Pervomaisky and Netailovo. They're another force. Then there's the Russian forces in Krasnogorovka who have been advancing along the streets that form the western spur of Krasnogorovka, and also advancing westwards through the fields in Krasnogorovka towards Kurakovo, and also ultimately the Russian troops further south still, who've just captured the village of Konstantinovka and who are pushing westwards and possibly northwards towards Kurakovo as well. And if all of these forces integrate with each other, and it's interesting fact because they belong in some cases to different groups of forces, but if these various forces all combine and come together, then notionally, possibly, a Ukrainian force, several thousand men, partly drawn from the troops who were defending Karlovka, but also other forces defending other positions in the areas northwest of Krasnogorovka and south of Selidovo and all of these places, they might eventually be encircled and taken into a proper cauldron. Now, I wonder whether the Ukrainians will let that happen. I would have thought that the Ukrainian General Staff, at least, will insist on the withdrawal of these troops before such an entrapment takes place. But anyway, it remains a possibility. Note, however, perhaps an even more important fact, that just as is the case in further east, where Russian troops who are pushing from Chasiv Yar and Kurdyumovka are now gradually linking up with Russian troops fighting in Toretsk, and Russian troops who are in the Toretsk area are starting to connect with Russian troops who are in the Ocheretino area. Well, we're starting to see the various formations, the various parts, the various different directions in which the Russian army has been advancing, that they're starting to converge together in positions north and west, well behind where the main Ukrainian defense lines used to be located. So the entire front line, in effect, is now moving, shifting further and further westwards. And before long, we're going to have a continuous front line, a straightening of the front line, simplifying the Russian advance, releasing more forces as the Russians continue to push forward and through. So anyway, that's the situation in the Pokrovsk area. Very dramatic. Now, there have been all kinds of reports circulating about what's going on in Kiev. Apparently, there's been fierce discussions underway in Kiev. General Syrsky, the Ukrainian military chief, has now published, I believe on his Telegram channel, I haven't seen it, but what looks to me like veiled criticism of the Kursk operation. He's saying that the purpose, one of the purposes, the main purpose of the Kursk operation was to compel the Russians to redeploy their forces from the Pokrovsk area. And that has not happened. That the Russians, instead of redeploying their forces from the Pokrovsk area to defend Kursk region, have, on the contrary, reinforced their advance in the Pokrovsk region. Now, that, of course, could be an admission of a huge mistake by himself. But I remember how at a fairly early stage in the Kursk operation, there were reports, I think one of them was picked up by Ukraine's 79th Brigade, the force that had been defending Konstantinovka, and before that Nova Mikhailovka. Anyway, there were reports in Ukraine that Syrsky had actually opposed the Kursk operation and that he was making that fact known, that he thought that it would be a disastrous diversion of Ukrainian forces from the main battle lines in Donbass to the forests and rivers and hills and small villages of Kursk region. And this latest comment of Syrsky's seems to me to reinforce that. It looks as if he's basically telling Zelensky, look, this plan that you forced upon me really hasn't worked. Everything that I warned you would happen has happened. The Russians didn't take the bait. And on the contrary, it is we now who are in serious trouble. Now, that's one thing that we can say. I mean, not my interpretation of Syrsky's words is my own, but that Syrsky has actually posted this comment about the fact that the Russians have not redeployed troops from the Pokrovsk area. Well, that is indisputably true. We have his actual words. It's a public it's a public statement. But other things that we're hearing are being muttered in private. And here, of course, we can't possibly confirm them. But they're rumours. I want to stress that they are only rumours and we should treat them as such. But they might be indicative of actual arguments that are taking place in Kiev. And for what they're worth, this is what they say. They say that Syrsky is now pleading with Zelensky to withdraw the troops, the Ukrainian troops from Kursk region, and to redeploy them to defend Pokrovsk. That the troops in Kursk region are needed in order to prevent a complete collapse of Ukrainian positions in Pokrovsk. Now, again, one must be very careful of confirmation bias, of the assumption that because one believes something, evidence or a rumour that comes which appears to confirm it must be true. But to me, that makes sense. And whatever one's opinions of Syrsky, he is, after all, a professional military officer who must be assumed to have some understanding of military matters. And it seems to me logical that he would be saying to Zelensky something like this. Anyway, the same rumours that are telling us that Syrsky is pleading with Zelensky to redeploy the troops from Kursk to Pokrovsk also tell us that, predictably enough, Zelensky has categorically said no. There might be an explanation for this in the Daily Telegraph today because, as we will discuss in more detail later, Zelensky and the civilian officials of the Ukrainian government are now spending a huge amount of time pleading with Western governments for permission to launch missile strikes deep into Russia. And the Daily Telegraph in London is telling us that one of the arguments they are making is that it's essential to build on the momentum that the Ukrainians supposedly have achieved through their advance into Kursk. And of course, that would be an impossible argument to make if, on the contrary, the Ukrainians pull out of Kursk. So, this whole project of getting permission to from the Western powers, essentially, by the way, from the United States, to conduct deep strikes into Russia, this supposedly, in the eyes or the belief of people like Zelensky and his foreign minister Kuleba and probably his defense minister Rustem Umerov, who's going to be meeting Lloyd Austin in Washington tomorrow, and Andrei Yermak, his chief of staff. Anyway, in the beliefs of these people, their hopes of getting permission for these deep strikes now hinges on the maintenance or the preservation of the illusion that Ukraine is on the offensive in Kursk. And that makes it impossible for them, as they see it, to agree to any withdrawal from Kursk. Now that, of course, isn't the only reason. I've discussed in other places that for Zelensky personally, a withdrawal from Kursk would be a political disaster. It would be a massive loss of face. It would open him up to huge criticism within Ukraine as to why Ukrainian troops were diverted from the key battlefronts to this specific adventure. But anyway, that's another story. Now, there is another rumor that's also circulating about what is being discussed between Syrsky and Zelensky in Kiev. And here it appears that Syrsky and Zelensky are in agreement, and that their agreement is that Pokrovsk itself must be defended at all costs, that the Ukrainians must dig in and fight resolutely and determinedly to hold Pokrovsk. It is too important, and its loss would be too disastrous for Ukraine to contemplate, so the Ukrainians must defend it. And yesterday in my program, I discussed how Zelensky is talking in grandiose terms of turning Pokrovsk into a fortress city, defending it with the same ferocity with which Bakhmut was defended just over a year ago, and inflicting the same kind of casualties on the Russians as they suffered in the capture of Bakhmut. So, on that, at least, Zelensky and Syrsky appear to agree. But of course, that then opens up the question as to who exactly is going to defend Pokrovsk. Because if the best Ukrainian troops are located in Kursk region, and there are reports that most of the Ukrainian troops who are fighting in Pokrovsk region are recently mobilized conscripts, some of them apparently in their late 50s or 60s, just saying. The question then comes, who exactly is going to defend Pokrovsk, especially if these troops are not insufficient number anyway and are insufficiently trained to defend the town? Well, as to that, we have some comments from the Ukrainian MP, Mariana Bezuglaya. She's been visiting the area and she's posted this following comment. The city, and she's talking now about Novogrodivka, was captured because the trenches in front of Novogrodivka were empty. In the city too, there were no preparations for defense and the presence of our military. In the once 20,000th city, she means that Novogrodivka was a city of 20,000 people, there was practically no Ukrainian army. The 31st Brigade in front of the city was removed. The brigade commander for whom the team asked was removed, and criminal proceedings were opened against him. I would remind you that there are still no cases against Sodol. Sodol was the Ukrainian general recently sacked in overall command of the Ukrainian ground forces, who many Ukrainians, including Bezuglaya, blame as having been principally responsible for the ongoing debacle. And then she goes on to say, instead, an inexperienced unit was sent there. And she also goes on to say this, a week ago, I went to the outskirts of Selidovo in the direction of Novogrodivka and saw fortifications in front of the city. This is presumably in the area of the coal mines and the slag heaps, about which so much has been written and said. And then she goes on to say this, there was nothing in the city itself, just an ordinary civilian settlement. I went into the trenches. Presumably these are the trenches in the coal mines and all those areas. No one was guarding them. No one was there. I went underground and went out into the field. I'm not quite sure what underground means. The Russians were already behind the field. There was no one else. I didn't get blown up by landmines. In other words, there was no landmines. I didn't meet any territorial defense fighters. Only insects were the only life in the prepared fortifications around Selidovo, which the Russians had been striving for 10 years. I'm not sure whether the reference to insects is to actual insects or whether this is some kind of slang for individual Ukrainian soldiers. But the point is that if there were such soldiers, they were just individuals. They were not really operating together as part of a team. And then she says that any civilian could have done what I did. And then she has posted an photo of empty trenches near Selidovo. Now, just to say, I've taken this translation and these words from the Moon of Alabama blog. That's where you will find them. Anyway, so it looks as if Bezuglaya went to Selidovo, found that there were no proper fortifications prepared around the town, that the units involved were untrained, and that they were not able to resist. And that is the reason why places like Selidovo and Novogorodivka are falling to the Russians so fast. Now, there are two possible explanations. One is that the Ukrainians, Syrsky and Zelensky, are withdrawing the more experienced Ukrainian fighters to Pokrovsk in order to make a stand to defend that town. The other is that without the elite units marooned in Kursk, there is simply no organized defense system in the area of Pokrovsk, and that is why we're seeing this accelerated collapse around there. As I am not familiar with the overall situation, I cannot say, but I would say this: even if the Ukrainians now do try to organize a defense of Pokrovsk, they have lost so much territory close to Pokrovsk. They will have lost so many important places. And as I've discussed already, Selidovo and Novogorodivka are connected to the main road and railway lines to Avdiivka and to Donetsk city, which provide a perfect logistical route to supply the Russian army. Anyway, the Ukrainians have ceded so much ground and so much important ground that it is very difficult for me, admittedly, a non-expert and a civilian, to see how Pokrovsk can be defended successfully for very long. Anyway, a disaster in the Pokrovsk area, and a disaster which is continuing to get worse. Now, before leaving this area entirely, I'm just going to say a little bit more about the situation further south. The Russians, as I've discussed, have now captured Konstantinovka. They appear to be pushing westwards and northwards. As I've said already, it might all be connected to the Russian advance towards Selidovo and maybe to the attempts to create a cauldron there, or it could be something else. But it does look as if the Russians are pushing towards Vodyanye, this village to the west of the highway that links Konstantinovka to Vuhledar, highway which is the main supply route for Vuhledar, which has now been comprehensively cut. In fact, this entire highway is now under Russian control. There are reports that the Russians are also approaching a coal mine, another coal mine, and slag heap located to the northeast of Vuhledar. Apparently, this isn't a particularly big slag heap or coal mine by comparison with some of the others. But for what it's worth, it looks as if the Russians will capture it fairly soon. And there are reports that the Russians have gradually been moving more troops, more forces, closer to Vuhledar itself. And DS, the Ukrainian mapping project, is talking about an encirclement operation being prepared by the Russians to encircle Vuhledar, trap the garrison inside Vuhledar, and ultimately capture and storm this important fortified city. Again, I wonder whether Syrsky and Zelensky will allow that to happen, whether before it happens they won't order a retreat from Vuhledar. But a little bit like Bakhmut, Vuhledar has been allowed by the Ukrainians to become an almost mythological place, a place that successfully resisted previous Russian attacks. It may be that Zelensky especially will feel that a retreat from Vuhledar, the abandonment of Vuhledar, after all that's been said and written about it, would be too big a psychological blow, in which case the hapless garrison that has the misfortune of trying to defend Vuhledar will be condemned to its inevitable fate of entrapment and ultimate defeat and capture of the survivors by the Russians. So there we go. That's what's going on in the south. Now, further east rather, there's also been a lot of news from Toretsk, not always very easy to understand. I've never found the battle for Toretsk particularly easy to understand because this metropolitan area is extremely complicated. But it does now look as if the Russians have almost captured the village of Druzhba, which lies to the northeast of Toretsk. And of course, the capture of Druzhba opens up a possibility for a further attack on Toretsk from the north. And we know that the Russians have also been advancing westwards from Kurdyumovka, in the Bakhmut area, by the way, across the Syrsky Donets aqueduct. And it could be that that's part of a plan to cut off the supply lines to Toretsk. I'm not going to get into the detail of all of that. There's also reports that the Russians have captured another slag heap. We're talking an awful lot about slag heaps nowadays. A slag heap that until a few days ago I had no idea even existed, which is in the southeastern part of Toretsk. And there's an industrial zone apparently just north of a prison, the Toretsk prison, which the Ukrainians have converted into what looks like a rather formidable defense position. It's got enormously heavy, powerful stone walls, two lines of walls, and the prison buildings are, as you would expect, extremely heavily built, difficult to break through. But then, as I've said in previous program, destroying fortified positions like that is what the Fab 3000 bombs are for, and no doubt before long the Russians will be using them against this particular prison area. But anyway, this military summary channel was speculating that the objective of the Russians is first of all to cut the supply lines from central Toretsk to this prison, in other words, isolating the garrison there. And I suspect that once that's happened, the Russians will begin bombing the prison, probably with their massive Fab bombs, and eventually, no doubt at all, the prison will also fall, opening up the way for the Russians to advance deeper into Toretsk from a different direction. It seems to me that the Russians are advancing in Toretsk from multiple directions, from the north, from the east, through the area of the high-rise buildings, and the south, from the southwest. It's difficult to say how long this battle will continue for, but the fact that the Ukrainians are evacuating Konstantinovka, the city of Konstantinovka, around 70,000 people, to the north of Toretsk, suggests that the situation is becoming very bad. So anyway, that's the situation. That's the situation as it's playing out there. As I said, there's probably a lot more going to happen over the next couple of days in the Toretsk area, and of course it bears watching. But there's also dramatic news coming from other places, not from Chasiv Yar or Siversk areas, where I've heard nothing of any great consequence over the last couple of days, but from the Kupiansk area. And partly this comes from the Russian Defense Ministry. They've said that a village called Stelmachovka, which is located south of Kupiansk in the area of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, has come under Russian control. There's been many reports about Stelmachovka and all kinds of claims about its importance and strategic significance, which I have never really understood, and I'm not going to try and understand that now. You can find all kinds of discussions about this in other places. But perhaps more interesting, at least for me, is that it looks as if the Russians are also advancing, breaking through, finally, in the village of Sinkovka. This is a village that lies just to the west, or to the east rather, of Kupiansk. It's often seen as the gateway to Kupiansk. The Russians captured various villages to the east of Sinkovka back in the autumn of 2023. There was many expectations, including from myself, that the Russians would then roll through Sinkovka and attack Kupiansk and would seek to break through towards Kupiansk and cross the Oskol River and move on towards ETHEREUM and perhaps Balakleya. By the way, in the process, cutting the main supply roads to the Ukrainian grouping in northern Donbass, which passes through these places and also through Kharkiv region. Anyway, that didn't happen in the autumn of 2023. The Russians reached Sinkovka and stopped, and there have been various battles or fights for Sinkovka. I've never got the impression that the Russians have made any serious attempt up to now to capture Sinkovka. There have been various suggestions that they have, but they've all turned out to be wrong. But now the Russians have released film of Russian troops raising their flags in parts of Sinkovka. And it's important to say that this appears to be, in its area, a fairly large village. And I understand that the building where this particular flag was raised, the one I've seen, is in the eastern part of Sinkovka. So it's likely that there's still fighting going on inside this village. It hasn't fully passed under Russian control. But it does look as if the Russians finally have made a decision to finish the battle of Sinkovka, to capture that particular village. All of these events happening, of course, in some way in conjunction with the Russian advances in all of the other villages east of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers to the south of Kupiansk. And we might be seeing an offensive develop towards Kupiansk itself. Now, it could be, it might be, that the reason for this is that the Russians have reason to think that further north, Volchansk, the big town to the north, near the Russian border, where a group of forces north has been fighting, that Volchansk itself is, well, if not about to fall, that the battle for Volchansk is ending. And again, you have to go to the maps and to look at the maps, but you can see that Volchansk is connected through all the roads and railway lines ultimately to Kupiansk. It would simplify Russian logistics in an offensive towards Kupiansk if the Russians were to capture Volchansk. And it might be that that is about to happen. Group of Forces North, they have this to say about the fighting in Volchansk. In the Volchansk direction, fighting continues in Volchansk. Assault groups started storming another apartment building in the neighborhood of the high-rise buildings. So it looks as if systematically, methodically, one by one, the forces of Group of Forces North have been clearing the high-rise building area in northern Volchansk. I think it is widely acknowledged that if this territory falls under Russian control, the Russians, by the way, already apparently control the aggregate plant to the south, then Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, becomes completely undefendable, and the rest of Volchansk, south of the Volcha River, will fall under Russian control fairly quickly. So it could be that the battle for Volchansk might be coming close to its end. This is, again, more a guess than a fact. We're not getting very much information about Volchansk because all the focus recently has been on what's going on in Kursk region. And here in Kursk region, I noticed that even mapping and blogging projects which were either very alarmed by or very enthusiastic about Ukraine's offensive into Kursk region now acknowledge that it has come to a complete stop and that the Ukrainians are gradually moving on to the defensive. There was an article in, I believe, the New York Times, which effectively conceded as much. It said that the Russians are gradually moving more and more forces to Kursk region from deep inside Russia, that they confounded Ukrainian expectations by not redeploying forces from Donbass, and that the number of forces that the Russians are deploying in this area is substantial, and that it's preventing further Ukrainian advances. And Abdi Alaudinov, the Chechen officer, has now told us about the current situation. He says that in most areas, this is in Kursk region, Ukrainian troops are actively digging in and building defensive lines, in other words, trenches. It is only in some sections that the enemy is trying to push through our positions. This really corresponds to what is taking place. So, in effect, the Ukrainians have exhausted their possibilities for an advance in the Kupiansk, in the Kursk area. They've now been forced to shift to the defensive. Now, I'm going to read what Group of Forces North are telling us about the situation in Kursk. They describe the situation in this way, and the Russian Defense Ministry essentially confirms their report tallies very closely with what Group of Forces North is saying. Group of Forces North say this: fierce fighting. There's been fierce fighting in the direction of Korenovo. During the day, we repelled 3 attacks on the village of Kremyanoye. Note that Group of Forces North take it for granted that Kremyanoye is under their control, with a total of up to 70 troops and 8 drones. Artillery fire and FPV drones destroyed up to 40 enemy troops and 6 BBMs. I'm not sure what the BBMs are, by the way. The enemy also tried to infiltrate into Komarovka settlement on foot through the forest belt, but was detected by our reconnaissance and destroyed. Note attacks taking place apparently mainly on foot now. The Ukrainians have suffered such severe vehicle losses, and perhaps are also short of fuel, that to the extent that attacks continue to happen in the Kursk area, the Ukrainian infantry advance mostly on foot. And then the Group of Forces North then goes on to say, to the north of Suja, we destroyed at least 40 Ukrainian fighters during an attempt to attack the villages of Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye and Novosonitsky It's the same places that we've been hearing time after time. I've said already that I think the purpose of the Ukrainians in trying to capture these villages, including the important village of Malaya Loknia, which now seems to be beyond their grasp, is not to provide a base for further advances northwards, but rather to create a defense lines around Suja. And the group of forces north say that 2 BBMs and a Ukrainian BMP were destroyed in this area. And then they also go on to say, in the Volchansk direction, fighting continues. Sorry, they also say in the south of Suja, counter battles continue. That appears to suggest a Russian advance leading to Ukrainian counterattacks. We repelled 2 counterattacks by up to 60 Ukrainian troops. The enemy's losses amounted to 20 troops killed. And they then go on to say that over the past day, enemy losses amounted to more than 390 people, including more than 253 in the Sumy direction. And the Russian Defense Ministry, by contrast, puts Ukrainian losses higher at around 400. And they say that Ukrainian losses in the Kursk offensive now number over 7,000 men wounded and killed. Very heavy rate of loss in less than a month of fighting. Then Group of Forces North finishes with these words. The media effect of Ukraine's invasion of the Kursk region is gradually coming to naught. Instead, the Ukrainian segment is increasingly discussing the collapse of the front in Pokrovsk. In this regard, the Ukrainian command may be preparing new provocations and attempts to break through the Russian border with a mass injection of false information through controlled resources. Meanwhile, we continue to gradually squeeze the enemy from the territory of Kursk region, not forgetting to cover other parts of the state border from a possible breakthrough. Notice the last words. We continue to gradually squeeze the enemy from the territory of Kursk region. A further confirmation that the Russians are gradually moving onto the offensive in Kursk region, and that appears to be what Alodinov is saying. Now, at this point, I'm going to quickly say that I suspect that the ability of the Ukrainians to hold on in Kursk region is being overstated by all sorts of people, including the New York Times. I think they imagine that the Ukrainians can hold on in Kursk region for weeks and months. I think it ultimately depends on what the Russians choose to do. But I think even without deploying forces from the Donbass, the Russians could, if they chose, deploy enough forces to drive the Ukrainians out of Kursk region within perhaps at most a couple of weeks. If the Russians recapture Suja, the entire logistical situation of the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region will collapse, and the Ukrainians will either have to withdraw or accept that large numbers of their best troops will be taken prisoner. This is a function of the road system in this area, and the fact that in an area of hills and forests, it is very, very difficult to keep logistics and men supplied. So I think that given that the entire defense position of the Ukrainians hinges on one small town And given that the Russians are very close to that town, they control villages like Ruskaya Konopalka and Martinovka, which are located perhaps 5 minutes drive from Suja itself. If the Russians make the decision to retake Suja, then we will quickly see the entire Ukrainian defense position in Kursk collapse. And there are reasons, as I discussed yesterday, to think that that is exactly what the Russians are going to do. They have apparently started shelling and bombing Ukrainian positions in Suja itself, which I see as consistent with a plan to storm and recapture that town. So it may be that the days of this operation, the Kursk offensive, are shorter than many people think. The only reason why the Russians would want to keep the Ukrainians in Kursk region is, of course, that whilst they are there, they are not elsewhere, in Donbass, for example, and they continue to suffer very heavy losses. The Russians are releasing lots of films of drones, Russian suicide drones, destroying Ukrainian armored vehicles and other vehicles in the Kursk area along these narrow, short roads. So bleeding the Ukrainians dry in Kursk might be a reason not to want to end this operation quickly. But as I've discussed before, there are political imperatives. And besides, I suspect that there is a current of opinion in Moscow which is distinctly uncomfortable with the fact that there are Ukrainian troops 30 or so kilometers from the Kursk nuclear power plant, and who feel that that is altogether too close and that it ought to be a priority to get them as far from that power plant as possible. So there we are. That is the situation on the battlefronts. I think the trajectory of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine is fairly clear. I think that Pokrovsk clearly remains a major objective, as obviously does Toretsk, as does Konstantinovka. The Russians are very close now to winning the Battle of Donbass. Once the Battle of Donbass is won and the Ukrainians are defeated there, then, of course, it will be for the Russians to decide what they're going to do next. I, for one, believe that once the Ukrainians have been defeated in Donbass, once not just Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, but also Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are captured, I think what the Russians will probably do is that they will direct an ultimatum to the Ukrainians, demanding that Zelensky and his government stand down, make way for someone else, and saying that if a new government is formed in Kiev, which is prepared to agree to Russian control of the 4 regions plus Crimea, and which is prepared to promise that Ukraine will under no circumstances enter NATO or come to or engage militarily with the West in any way, in other words, will revert to complete neutrality, then the Russians might say, well, provided that happens, then it might be possible to negotiate an end to the war. I think the Russians might do that because perhaps their friends, China, India, the Arab states, other countries, might want them to do it. But if the Ukrainians reject that ultimatum, and it will be an ultimatum, it will not be an offer to negotiate, the Russians will set out the terms and simply demand that the Ukrainians agree to them and enter into a formal treaty ratifying them. If the Ukrainians reject those terms, if Zelensky insists on remaining in power in Kiev, if the remainder of the Russian proposals is rejected, then I think the Russians have very clearly signalled what their next step is going to be, an advance ultimately on Kiev itself, regime change in Kiev at the very least, and the subjugation, in effect, of the rest of Ukraine by the Russians, with possibly a government established in Kiev which the Russians feel they can trust to remain friendly to themselves. That seems to me a fairly plausible outline of what the Russians might do. I would say that Glenn Deason and myself have had a most interesting discussion with Dmitry Polyansky, who's Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN. You can see it on the Duran. Polyansky, in that interview, confirmed what Alex Christoforou and I had discussed in earlier programs on the Duran, that the Russians had indeed come under significant pressure from their friends, China, India, other countries in the global south, to enter into negotiations with Ukraine, and that the Kursk operation, from a Russian point of view, has come as a relief, because those parties who had been wanting the Russians to engage in negotiations realized after Kursk that negotiations with the Zelensky government are impossible. Now, I think, as I said, we can get a fairly clear idea from the many comments and statements that Russian officials have made about how they intend to proceed. I want to stress this is proceed in the medium term. I'm not making any speculations about what would happen eventually if the Russian terms were met. It's still very unclear to me whether the Russians, for example, have any specific plans about what to do with Western Ukraine. But what about the Ukrainians? What about Zelensky? Well, I think it's now absolutely clear, as I discussed in my program yesterday, that Zelensky has no interest in negotiations at all. I think this was also made clear, by the way, as a result of Prime Minister Modi's visit to Kiev. I understand that Prime Minister Modi has come under some criticism in India for making that visit. Apparently, I was informed about this by a member of the Duran community on a live stream that we did on the Duran. Anyway, it seems that Modi was only in Kiev for a few hours, but I think what he found when he discussed the situation with Zelensky, and it's reflected in the joint statement that Ukraine and India published, that Zelensky ultimately is uninterested and probably incapable of compromise, of accepting realities. He still demands the impossible, that his own peace formula, the Zelensky plan, be unconditionally accepted, requiring the complete withdrawal of all Russian forces from Crimea and all of the rest of pre-2014 Ukraine, and that the only negotiations that then take place will be negotiations about payment of reparations and war crimes trials for Russian leaders and that kind of thing. So I think that Modi came away from Kiev very disappointed And I think that is the general feeling, by the way, across the global south. I think they understand now, after Kursk and perhaps after Modi's visit, how difficult to negotiate with, in fact, impossible to negotiate with, the current government in Kiev is. But if negotiations are ruled out, what is Zelensky's plan? Well, I said yesterday that he has what he calls a victory plan. He's come up with all sorts of grandiose ideas about what to do. But with every hour that passes, it's absolutely clear, to me at least, what that plan is. Apparently, it is to get the Americans to agree to deep strikes inside Russia. And the nature of the strikes that Zelensky is talking about is that apparently the Dutch government has now issued a statement saying that they absolutely prohibit the use of F-16s, the F-16s that they're supplying by the Zelensky government, to conduct strikes against civilian targets inside Russia, which, by the way, is an interesting admission from the Dutch that they expect Zelensky and the Ukrainians to try to use the F-16s to carry out strikes inside Russia, despite all the claims that the F-16s are there purely in an air defense capacity. And of course, they want the same permission with respect to the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows, and they are now talking about the fact that they've got their own cruise missiles. Apparently, the cruise missile that they claim to have developed is got roughly the same sort of range as the ATACMS, so it's not quite as long range as I believed, and this ballistic missile that Zelensky is talking about. Now, I personally have no doubt about what Zelensky's plan is, what he wants to do, what his plan is, and it's the only plan I think that he has. Now that the Kursk operation is failing and it's becoming increasingly clear that the military situation is collapsing, I think what his plan is to conduct some kind of missile war precisely against Russian civilian targets, to bomb and strike at those targets, perhaps to attack nuclear installations like the Kursk nuclear power plant, though they will be very heavily defended. And in most cases, I would have thought that they are adequately shielded against against missile or drone attacks. And of course, he wants to attack air bases, but again, those places will be very heavily defended as well. Ultimately, and I've seen reports about this, I think that he imagines that missile strikes against Russian cities, against especially Moscow and St. Petersburg, are somehow going to change the whole political mood, shift the whole political mood in Russia, and cause a massive revulsion against President Putin, and will lead to peace. And I think that is all that he is prepared to think about. I think that negotiations for him remains an inconceivable idea. I think in this he is in tune with the rest of the Maidan movement, which has at no time ever, at any point in its existence, even before it came to power in Ukraine, showed the least ability to compromise on its demands or to come to some kind of understanding with those that it saw as its opponents, both its domestic opponents and, of course, its external opponents, who are, of course, the Russians. So I think this is what Zelensky plans to do. Now, the things to say about it is that, first of all, if he ever does get his plan realised of missile strikes against Russian civilian facilities, including perhaps Moscow and St. Petersburg, it is not going to have the effect that he thinks. Now, I was reading in Simplicius the Thinker and in other places that Putin's popularity dropped directly after the start of the Kursk incursion. The trouble is, you get a graph which has been provided by the relevant polling agency, which is the Levada Center, which is a polling agency, a Russian polling agency, which is politically hostile to Putin, just saying, though an accurate one. But the graph is actually very misleading because it shows jagged upward rises and falls, and it all looks very dramatic. You see a high and then a fall. But the fall, when you actually look at the percentages, is from an approval rating of 80% to an approval rating of 78%. In other words, a 2% drop for a politician whose normal approval rating hovers around 80%. A 2% drop is insignificant. It is probably within the margin of error. It suggests that the Kursk operation has had no effect on Putin's overall popularity in Russia at all. Just saying. Missile strikes on Moscow and St. Petersburg, if they ever happen, are not going to change that sentiment towards a mood of compromise or at least capitulation with respect to Ukraine. What they're going to do is lead to more demands for further decisive action from the Russian people against Ukraine itself. It will also, this is what is particularly dangerous, lead to demands for retaliatory action against the Western powers. And that probably is the other part of Zelensky's plan. Because, as Gideon Rachman's article in the Financial Times effectively said, what Zelensky's plan actually amounts to is a plan to get the West to fight his war for him. Now, I hope that Western leaders understand this and understand what a disastrous road they would be taking if they agreed to this. If missile strikes against Russia take place, I think, as I discussed in my program yesterday, that has come far too late now to change the military situation, where the Russians at the gates of Pokrovsk and reaching the Dnieper fairly soon. It's not going to change the military balance. What it will do is strengthen global support, international support for the Russians, who will be able to rightly say that NATO missiles are being used to attack their cities, and who will point out how dangerous it is for them to have Ukraine become a NATO country equipped with NATO missiles on their western border. So that's the first thing to say. But, of course, the Russians will consider this a major crossing of a red line, and they will take retaliatory action in their own way against the West. And we will move, in that case, from a position where the Russians are not just adversaries, but in their own self-perception, that we and they have become enemies of each other. We will have involved ourselves in a direct attack on Russian cities. Now, that has awesome implications going forward. It goes far beyond what was the case during the Cold War. It will involve the Russian people. It will affect the attitudes of the Russian people in a way that they were never affected in the same way during the Cold War, where on the contrary, memories of the West, who had been allies during the Second World War, tended with many Russians to be quite favourable. I hope that this is understood in the West, that giving this kind of helping hand to a drowning man is not going to help the drowning man. It is simply going to enable that man to pull us into the same sea in which he is drowning. But I have to say also that though I think some people in the West, including within the US government, understand this, though disastrously no one in the British government seems to do, I also have to say that the pattern of this conflict so far is that every time the Ukrainians demand an escalation, the West ultimately complies, because the political imperative in the West is to prevent a Ukrainian collapse, which will discredit the Western politicians who gave their support to the Ukraine project in the first place and who remain, for the moment, in control. Well, those politicians are becoming increasingly unpopular. In the United States, the president himself is due to leave the scene over the next few months. In Britain, Boris Johnson has long since left the political scene and is unlikely to return. In France, there's talk of a general strike, as I understand, to demand President Macron's resignation, though that is connected more to the political crisis inside France. And in Germany, well, there's going to be regional elections fairly soon. And there's lots of talk that the Scholz coalition is in deep trouble. But for the moment, as I said, they remain in control. And whenever they've had to make a choice, they have consistently made the wrong one. I hope this time it will be different. But I have no reason to believe that will be so. And as we enter the end game in Ukraine, because that's what it looks like to me, it seems to me that we are not only doubling down in the West, but are doubling down in a way that ensures that the loss, when it comes, will be far more catastrophic than anyone could once have imagined. Anyway, on that troubling note, I end this program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also go to our shop. And please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.